Picture a massive 2-ton Asian elephant.
Terrifying, honestly.
Right. It is terrified, it's trumpeting, and it's being slowly, painstakingly coaxed up this groaning wooden ramp.
And this isn't a modern steel dock either.
No, exactly. Below that ramp is just the deck of a wooden ship floating off the coast of the Philippines in the 17th century.
Which is just wild to visualize.
It really is. And the ship itself, it isn't held together by iron nails or anything. It is literally stitched together with ropes made of coconut fiber.
Yeah, just organic material holding a multi-ton animal.
Right. So the handlers are sweating, they're shouting commands, just desperately trying to stabilize this colossal animal because they're about to sail it across the open ocean to the island of Borneo.
Just to give it to a king as a gift.
Exactly. It's an almost unbelievable image.
I mean, the logistics alone are staggering. The sheer weight of the elephant dealing with the movement of the ocean, just feeding the animal.
Yeah, how much does an elephant eat on a sea voyage?
Right. It just seems utterly impossible for the technology at the time.
And yet we know it happened. Or, well, at least the genetic footprint of modern elephants points to events exactly like this.
Yeah, the DNA doesn't lie.
No, it doesn't. So today we are taking a deep dive into the pre-colonial Indo-Pacific world. And to do that, we've pulled together just a massive stack of sources for you.
We really did. We're looking at everything from ancient archaeological records to cutting-edge genomic studies.
Right, genomic studies on Asian fauna, comparative literature analyses, tectonic geology. We aren't just looking at dusty historical texts here.
No, the mission of this deep dive is to uncover the vast shared history of South and Southeast Asia, and doing it completely devoid of the usual Western-centric timelines.
Exactly, because the timeline we are looking at is just sprawling.
It is. We are tracing how early maritime trade networks essentially acted as the circulatory system for half the globe.
Yeah, these routes didn't just move nutmeg and gold around. They fueled profound cultural and biological exchanges.
They forced massive foundational epics like the Ramayana to just completely morph and adapt to entirely new landscapes.
And like we mentioned with the elephant, they literally reshaped the evolutionary tree of animals like tigers and elephants.
It's all connected.
It really is. And for those of you listening who, prefer to get out of the armchair and actually touch history, we are concluding this deep dive with an exclusive, highly curated travel itinerary.
Places you can actually go to.
Exactly. We combed the sources for breathtaking, uncrowded historical sites surrounded by incredible natural landscapes.
Places where you can physically stand at the crossroads of this ancient global network.
Yeah, without fighting for space with 1,000 other tourists trying to take a selfie.
Which is always a plus.
Always. Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the foundation.
Yeah.
Because the engine of this entire Indo-Pacific world, it wasn't a king and it wasn't an army. It was the wind.
Specifically the monsoon.
Right.
Because the foundational era of this massive interconnected network, it really begins to accelerate around 500 BCE.
Which is incredibly early.
Yeah, long before the European colonial era, and even long before the famous Overland Silk Road reached its absolute peak.
So who was driving this?
You had Austronesian sailors originating from island Southeast Asia, places we now call Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines.
Right.
And they were already master navigators of the open ocean. I mean, they were sailing across the Bay of Bengal and the vast Indian Ocean.
Making direct contact with southern India and Sri Lanka.
Exactly.
Just to anchor you, the listener, in time 500 BCE is roughly when the Roman Republic is just taking its very first baby steps in Italy.
Barely getting started.
Right. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, these Austronesian sailors are crossing highly unpredictable oceans.
And they're doing it in vessels that honestly completely defy modern Western intuitions about shipbuilding.
Yes, the sources go into deep detail about these sewn plank and lashed lug ships.
The engineering is just brilliant, primarily because it relies on working with nature rather than fighting it.
How so?
Well, think about how we build ships today. If you build a rigid ship using thick wooden planks and heavy iron nails, you are creating a structure that strongly resists force.
Okay, that makes sense.
But when a massive ocean wave hits a rigid hull, the hull tries to hold its exact shape, and water is incredibly heavy.
Right. Ocean storms generate massive kinetic energy.
Exactly. So eventually, rigid materials will crack, shatter, or just snap under enough pressure.
It's like, it's the same principle as building a skyscraper in an earthquake zone.
That's a great comparison.
If you build it completely rigid, it just snaps in half. You have to build it to sway. You have to build in flexibility.
That is the perfect way to look at it. Think of these sewn plank ships like a floating suspension bridge.
Okay, I like that visual.
The shipwrights would shape the wooden planks of the hull, but instead of nailing them to a rigid frame, they would drill these small holes along the edges.
And then literally sew them together.
Literally sew them together. They use cordage made from highly durable natural fibers, primarily coconut coir.
Which is just the tough, fibrous husk of the coconut, right?
Exactly. It's incredibly resilient, especially in salt water.
I read the breakdown on the lash lug component in the sources, too. This is wild. On the inside of these wooden planks, they carved these protruding blocks of wood, the lugs.
Yeah, they didn't attach them. They carved them directly out of the plank itself.
Which makes them so much stronger. And then they would run ropes through these lugs, lashing the entire inside of the hull together.
So the whole ship is basically a giant, flexible wooden basket.
A giant wooden basket crossing the ocean.
Yep. So when a massive swell hits it in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, the ropes stretch, the planks flex, the water might seep in a tiny bit.
But the ship doesn't shatter.
Exactly. It absorbs the kinetic energy and keeps right on moving.
It was this specific technological innovation that allowed them to survive the extreme weather of the Indian Ocean.
And ultimately establish what we now call the Maritime Silk Road and the spice routes.
But even with these amazing flexible ships, they couldn't just sail wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted.
No, not at all. They were entirely bound to the thermodynamic engine of the monsoons.
I think we need to define that term, actually. Because if you watch the evening news today, a monsoon just means a catastrophic rainstorm.
Right. We use it to mean heavy rain. But historically and meteorologically, it is a wind system.
Where does the word even come from?
The term actually originates from the Arabic word mausim, which simply means season.
Yeah.
A monsoon is literally a seasonal reversing wind, and it is entirely driven by temperature differences between the land and the ocean.
So how does that thermal engine work?
Well, in the spring and summer months, the massive Asian landmass heats up significantly faster than the Indian Ocean.
Because land absorbs heat faster than water.
Exactly. And as that hot air over the land rises, it creates a massive low-pressure vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
It does. So cooler, moisture-heavy air from over the ocean rushes in to fill that void.
Which creates the wind.
Yes, a powerful, consistent wind blowing from the southwest to the northeast.
But then the seasons change.
Right. In the fall and winter, the process flips. The massive landmass cools down much faster than the ocean waters, which hold on to their heat longer.
So now the high pressure is over the land.
And the wind completely reverses. It starts blowing steadily from the northeast back down toward the southwest.
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of a merchant in Southeast Asia. You want to sail to India, you wait for the northeast monsoon in the winter.
Yeah, the wind just pushes you all the way to the Malabar coast of India.
But here's the massive catch. Once you arrive, you can't just conduct your business, turn around, and go home a week later.
Because the wind is blowing directly in your face.
Right. What's fascinating here is how this natural meteorological phenomenon fundamentally dictated human sociology.
It really did. Because merchants were effectively hostages to the wind.
They couldn't just do a quick transaction at the docks.
No. If you sailed to Calicut in India or to Guangzhou in China, you had to wait months for the thermal engine of the continent to reverse before you could safely sail home.
You are literally living there for half the year.
Yes.
You are renting property. You're buying groceries in the local market. You're hanging out in the local taverns, talking to people.
And you are inevitably getting involved in local politics.
And quite frequently, according to the sources, marrying into the local population.
Exactly. Over decades and centuries, this seasonal waiting period resulted in the establishment of massive, permanent diaspora communities in these port cities.
So you'd have enclaves of Tamil merchants living permanently in the Indonesian archipelago.
Or Arab traders settled in India.
And Southeast Asian navigators establishing entire neighborhoods in southern China.
It wasn't merely a transactional exchange of goods. It was a deep, sustained merging of bloodlines, languages, and daily lives.
I really want to challenge a prevailing assumption here for you listening, because I think modern audiences, especially in the West, we view globalized cosmopolitan trade as a very recent invention.
Oh, absolutely.
We picture the Dutch East India Company in the 1600s or the invention of the standardized shipping container in the 1950s. We think of globalization as guys in suits in New York and London.
But our sources paint a totally different picture.
Right. These ancient ports were essentially the original Wall Streets and Silicon Valleys.
They were intense, hyper-connected melting pots of global merchant capitalism.
A trader from South India living in a Southeast Asian port might have had infinitely more in common culturally and economically with an Austronesian sailor from thousands of miles away than he would with a farmer living 50 miles inland from his own hometown.
The sociological data entirely supports that view. You are describing a true transnational maritime identity.
People who belong to the ocean.
Exactly, they belong to the ocean and the ports, not necessarily the inland empires.
But we do have to acknowledge that those inland empires played a massive role in supercharging this network.
Oh, without a doubt. The Mauryan Empire in India is a perfect example of how terrestrial politics influenced maritime trade.
Yeah, the Mauryan Empire thrived from roughly 322 to 185 BCE, and the sources outline a fascinating domino effect here regarding them.
It all starts with gold.
India has always had a massive appetite for gold.
And historically, much of it came overland through the Himalayas, originating from sources deep in Siberia and Central Asia.
Right. The Mauryan Empire had a vast, incredibly complex economy, and gold was its lifeblood.
But then, nomadic tribes in Central Asia began heavily disrupting those overland trade routes.
The caravans were being raided, the mountain passes were blocked.
And suddenly, the Mauryan gold supply was facing a catastrophic bottleneck.
And if you're an empire, you don't just accept a shrinking economy.
Or find a new source.
So Indian merchants physically turned their backs on the northern mountains and looked east,
Across the Bay of Bengal.
toward the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago.
And you can track this shift in the texts. The ancient Sanskrit and Pali texts, like the Jatakas, start referencing this region using terms like Suvarnabhumi
Which means the land of gold.
and Suvarnadvipa, the island of gold.
It was essentially an ancient gold rush.
Yes. They utilized the existing Austronesian maritime networks to access the mineral wealth of Southeast Asia.
But it is crucial to understand that this was not a one-way extraction. The exchange was deeply reciprocal.
Because the Austronesian sailors were bringing an incredible bounty westward, too.
We are talking about coconuts, sandalwood, early domesticated bananas, sugarcane.
But the real prize, the cargo that would literally shape global empires for the next 2 millennia, was spices.
Specifically, spices that only grew in tiny, isolated volcanic pockets of the Indonesian archipelago.
Like cloves and nutmeg.
The botanical isolation of those spices is key.
Yeah, nutmeg, for instance, is the seed of the Myristica fragrance tree. And historically, it grew almost exclusively on the tiny Banda Islands in the Maluku archipelago.
If you wanted it, you had to cross the ocean.
There was no other way.
If you, the listener, walk into your kitchen right now and look in your spice rack, find the little jar of ground nutmeg or whole cloves.
Just look at it.
You're looking at the exact biological catalyst that wired half the ancient globe together.
People were literally risking their lives in hand-sewn, rope-tied wooden baskets.
Riding unpredictable seasonal thermal winds for months at a time, just to secure the genetic ancestors of the powder you use for holiday baking.
It is mind-blowing when you think about it that way.
And to complete the reciprocal picture, we have hard archaeological evidence of what India was sending back east in exchange for that nutmeg and gold.
Right, if we look at the Khao Sam Keo site in southern Thailand,
Which dates between 400 and 100 BCE.
we find South Asian crops like mung beans and horse grams suddenly appearing in the agricultural record there.
Just popping up in Thailand.
We also find early Indian glass beads and very specific semi-precious stone ornaments.
And some of those feature distinct northern Indian manufacturing techniques, right?
Exactly, and they are sitting right alongside local Southeast Asian artifacts.
It is the ultimate ancient global exchange. But here is the thing about human beings. When you have hundreds of merchants sitting in a port city for 6 months waiting for the wind to change, they don't just sit in silence.
No, they drink, they talk, they argue.
They share their philosophies, their political systems, and their gods.
Which leads us to a massive continental cultural shift.
This shift is a phenomenon that early 20th century historians broadly labeled Indianization.
Right. From the first millennium CE onward, a wave of Indian cultural, political, and religious influence swept through Southeast Asia.
Deeply impacting the formation of early kingdoms and empires like Funan, Chenala, and Champa in modern-day Vietnam.
And later, the massive maritime empires of Srivijaya and Majapahit in Indonesia.
Okay, I have to jump in and push back on that term, Indianization.
It's definitely a controversial term today.
Because to a modern ear, that sounds suspiciously like colonization.
It does. It implies that an Indian emperor built a massive armada, sailed to Vietnam or Java, planted a flag, and violently forced the local populations to start reading Sanskrit and building Hindu temples.
Was there economic coercion? Like, if you don't adopt the religion of your biggest trading partner, don't you lose out on the gold trade?
That is a very valid critique, and modern scholarship heavily debates the mechanics of this transfer. But the historical sources are quite clear. This was not a military colonization.
There was no centralized Indian empire dictating terms to Southeast Asia.
No. There's one exception in the sources, though.
Right, the naval expedition.
Yes. Launched by Rajendra Chola of the South Indian Chola dynasty in 1025 CE against the Srivijaya Empire.
But even that was primarily a raid to break a trade monopoly and protect commercial interests.
Exactly. It was not an attempt to establish a permanent colonial occupation. It was an anomaly.
So the primary mechanism of cultural transfer wasn't the sword?
It was the merchant ship and the passengers it carried. Brahmins, high caste Hindu priests and scholars, and Buddhist monks began traveling alongside the spice merchants.
And when they arrived in these bustling Southeast Asian ports, the local indigenous elites actively sought them out.
Which is the key distinction.
Why would a local chieftain in Sumatra or Borneo seek out a foreign priest, though? What is the political utility?
It comes down to political legitimacy. In many pre-existing indigenous Southeast Asian societies, political power was often derived from martial prowess, charisma, or control of immediate resources.
You were the chief because you were the strongest warrior, or you controlled the best river valley.
Right. But the Brahmins brought with them a sophisticated Indian political and religious philosophy, most notably the concept of the Devaraja.
The king of God's cult.
Exactly.
So instead of telling your rivals, I am in charge because I have the most men with spears, you can tell them, I am in charge because I am literally the earthly manifestation of the Hindu god Shiva, or an avatar of Vishnu.
That is an incredible political upgrade.
It totally insulates you from mundane challenges to your authority.
It is the ultimate political trump card divine right. But to claim that divine right, to properly consecrate yourself as a Devaraja, you needed someone who knew the exact, highly complex Sanskrit rituals.
You couldn't just declare it yourself. You needed a Brahmin.
So, local Southeast Asian elites actively invited these Indian scholars into their courts. They employed them as priests, astrologers, and administrators.
Which completely proves that Indianization is a terrible word for this.
It implies Southeast Asia was just a passive sponge soaking up Indian culture.
But if they are actively inviting priests in to serve their own political ends, it's much more strategic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, modern scholars prefer terms like indigenization or localization.
The Southeast Asians were highly selective consumers of culture.
They actively filtered Indian concepts through their own societal needs.
I think of it like going to a massive global cultural buffet.
A buffet, yeah.
You walk down the line, you take a scoop of the Sanskrit language because it's great for writing legal inscriptions. You take a big helping of the Devaraja concept because it secures your throne.
You grab a few Hindu and Buddhist deities because the cosmologies are beautiful.
But then you get to the rigid Indian caste system and you leave it sitting under the heat lamp. You don't put it on your plate.
That analogy holds up perfectly. The caste system, the rigid, hierarchical social stratification that is completely foundational to Orthodox Hinduism in India, was largely rejected in Southeast Asia.
Just didn't work for them.
It simply didn't map onto their pre-existing social structures. Their societies were often much more fluid, egalitarian in terms of gender.
And sometimes even matrilineal, right? Where property and lineage are traced through the mother.
Exactly. So they took the divine rituals, but they entirely discarded the social hierarchy that came with them.
It's fascinating. And the things they did choose to keep, they didn't just copy. They merged them with their own ancient beliefs.
It was a true synthesis.
I want to drill down into the mechanics of that fusion.
Yeah.
How exactly do you take an imported Hindu god and make it work with local Southeast Asian animism?
Well, let's look at Shaivism, the worship of the Hindu god Shiva.
Okay.
In classical Indian Hinduism, Shiva is frequently worshipped in the form of a linga.
This is an abstract aniconic representation, right?
Yes, usually a smooth, cylindrical stone pillar set in a base. It represents divine, formless, generative energy.
Got it.
Now, before the arrival of Hinduism, many Southeast Asian cultures practiced a deep ancient tradition of mountain worship.
They believed that the highest peaks were the literal dwelling places of their ancestral spirits.
And the protective gods of the land.
So you have an imported stone pillar representing a supreme god and a local mountain representing ancestral power.
Exactly. When the Brahmins introduced the Shiva Linga, the local Southeast Asian rulers recognized the synergy immediately.
They saw the overlap.
They began constructing massive stepped pyramids or utilizing actual mountains and placing the Shiva Linga at the very summit.
The Hindu concept of a universal supreme deity merged seamlessly with the indigenous concept of the localized mountain spirit.
By worshipping the linga on the mountain, the king was simultaneously validating his power through the cosmos of India and the ancestral earth of his own people.
That is brilliant religious and political engineering.
It really is.
And we have concrete physical evidence of just how far this cultural buffet reached. Our sources detail a specific archaeological find in Borneo the Kutai inscriptions.
Oh, the Kutai Yupas. These are some of the most startling artifacts in the region.
Let's explain what a yupa is.
A yupa is a sacrificial stone pillar. And in the deep, dense rainforests of eastern Borneo, specifically in the Kutai region, archaeologists uncovered 7 of these massive stone pillars.
Dating back to around 400 CE,
Yes.
Borneo. I need the listener to visualize this. Borneo is a massive island covered in some of the oldest, densest rainforests on Earth.
It is thousands of miles of open ocean and jagged coastline away from the Indian subcontinent.
And yet, carved directly into these stone pillars deep in that rainforest is the Indic Pallava script.
Which is astounding.
Let's define that. Pallava is a script originating from the Pallava dynasty in South India, right?
Yes, it's a very specific alphabet used to write Sanskrit.
So you have a South Indian script, writing the Sanskrit language, standing in a Bornean jungle.
And the text itself is what's truly amazing. It documents the actions of a local king named Mulavarman.
Okay, Mulavarman.
The inscriptions detail how he's performing elaborate, orthodox, Vedic Hindu sacrifices.
Okay, Orthodox Vedic sacrifices. What does that actually entail in a 4th century context?
The Vedic tradition is the oldest layer of Sanskrit literature and ritual. A Vedic sacrifice usually involves constructing precise fire altars, chanting complex Sanskrit hymns.
And offering immense wealth to the gods, right?
Often managed by a small army of Brahmin priests. The Kutai inscriptions specifically state that King Mulavarman gifted massive herds of cows to the Brahmins as part of this ritual.
Cows. They're importing the sacred cattle complex of India into the equatorial rainforests of Borneo just to legitimize a local king.
It completely shatters the idea that this cultural exchange was limited to a few coastal trading ports.
It penetrated the deep interior.
It proves that the localization of Indian culture was profound, but the ultimate proof of this highly creative adaptation isn't found carved in stone.
No, it is found in the literature. It is found in how Southeast Asia took the most sacred foundational texts of India and completely rewrote them.
Which brings us to the epic tapestry, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
For anyone unfamiliar, these are the 2 massive ancient Sanskrit epics of India. They are foundational.
Absolutely foundational.
The Ramayana tells the story of Prince Rama, an avatar of the god Vishnu, whose wife Sita is kidnapped by the demon king Ravana.
And Rama goes on a massive quest to rescue her, aided by an army of monkeys led by the devoted monkey god Hanuman.
Right. And the Mahabharata is a sprawling, incredibly complex dynastic tragedy about a massive war between 2 factions of a royal family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas.
In India, these are deeply sacred texts. Reading them or hearing them recited is a devotional act.
But as these epics crossed the Bay of Bengal on those monsoon winds, they underwent a radical, almost shocking transformation.
As they permeated Southeast Asia, they largely shed their strict Hindu bhakti or devotional flavor.
They transitioned from being primarily religious scriptures into becoming secularized manuals for statecraft.
Models for aristocratic behavior.
And above all, highly entertaining, localized drama.
I love this part of the research.
Me too. Imagine your favorite, incredibly serious superhero franchise being rebooted in 10 different countries.
Best way to describe it.
In one country, the loyal sidekick suddenly becomes the main character. In another, the villain gets a sympathetic origin story.
In another, the entire setting is moved from a sprawling metropolis to your own local neighborhood.
That is exactly what happened to the Ramayana.
Let's examine Thailand's version, the Ramakin. In the original Indian Sanskrit text, Hanuman the monkey god is the absolute embodiment of pure, celibate, unwavering devotion to Rama.
He is a paragon of piety.
But in the Thai remaking, Hanuman gets a major personality overhaul.
Oh, he becomes a mischievous, swashbuckling rake. He is a blatant ladies' man.
Yes. Throughout the Thai narrative, he actively seduces multiple women. He even enchants the demon king Ravana's own sister.
And most famously, there is an entire subplot where he falls in love with and seduces Ravana's mermaid daughter, Suvarnamacha.
A mermaid daughter. Let me check my notes on the original Valmiki Ramayana. Nope, no mermaids there.
No, they entirely invented a marine subplot to fit their own maritime geography.
Exactly, and the localization shifts again when you look at Laos.
Their national epic is the Phra Lak Phra Ram.
Phra Lak refers to Lakshmana, Rama's loyal brother. This version significantly elevates Lakshmana, focusing heavily on the fraternal bond.
But the most profound change is theological, right?
Yes. Laos is a deeply Buddhist culture, so they integrated the Hindu epic directly into their own religious framework.
The Lao text literally casts Gautama Buddha himself as a future incarnation of Rama.
So they took the foundational Hindu epic and retrofitted it to be a prequel to the life of the Buddha.
That is an astonishing piece of cultural synthesis.
They localized the divine lineage to fit their own spiritual reality.
What about Cambodia?
In Cambodia, you find the Reamker. And this version isn't just a manuscript, it is physically carved into the cultural identity of the Khmer people.
The narrative is deeply integrated into the breathtaking stone frescoes of Angkor Wat.
Blending the story inextricably with classical Khmer dance and royal architecture.
But what happens when you move down into the island nations, into the Indonesian archipelago and the Malay Peninsula?
Well, in Malaysia, you have the Hikayat Seri Rama, and in Java, the Kakawin Ramayana.
Okay.
But in Indonesia, particularly in Java and Bali, it is actually the Mahabharata that truly captures the cultural imagination.
And it does so through a very specific, mesmerizing medium, doesn't it?
Yes, wayang, the traditional shadow puppetry.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Our sources explore a theory about how this shadow puppet theater might have originated, and it ties right back to the ocean.
I need the listener to visualize this scene.
Okay, you are a storyteller, a merchant, or a sailor traveling on one of those flexible sewn-plank ships we discussed earlier.
You are out in the middle of the ocean, or maybe anchored in a calm, foreign bay.
It is pitch black night. The only source of light comes from the flickering oil lamps burning on the wooden deck.
And stretched out behind those lamps are the massive, tightly woven cloth sails of the ship.
The sail acts as a massive natural projection screen.
Right.
The theory suggests that storytellers would hold up intricately carved pieces of leather or wood between the oil lamp and the illuminated sail.
And from the other side of the sail, the crew and the merchants would watch these massive, dynamic, flickering shadows.
Acting out the battles of the Mahabharata, the merchant ships themselves were the very first shadow theaters.
It's a deeply evocative image, and it perfectly illustrates how commerce and art are fundamentally inseparable in this history.
And just as the Thai writers changed Hanuman, the Javanese puppeteers drastically altered the Mahabharata for the wayang theater.
They introduced entirely new characters that do not exist in the Indian original.
Characters like Semar.
Yes, Semar is arguably the most important figure in Javanese wayang.
He is a local Javanese comic hero, completely unique to the island.
Visually, he is misshapen, physically awkward, and often provides body comic relief alongside his three strange sons.
But structurally, he is actually a deeply wise, ancient guardian god of the island in disguise.
He offers profound philosophical commentary, acting as the voice of the common people amidst the aristocratic warfare of the epic heroes.
He became so wildly popular that in many Javanese retellings, the classical Indian epic only takes up the first half of the performance.
The second half is entirely dominated by the localized adventures of Semar.
The comic relief sidekick gets so popular that he essentially hijacks the narrative and gets his own spin-off that takes over the main storyline. I love it.
It's incredible, but this brings up a massive historical friction point.
Right. As the centuries rolled on, the religious landscape of Malaysia and Indonesia shifted dramatically.
Islam arrived again, largely traveling along those exact same maritime trade routes, and gradually became the dominant religion.
By the 15th and 16th centuries, you have powerful, devout Islamic sultanates ruling the region.
And this creates a severe ideological conflict.
Because under strict Islamic law, or Sharia, depicting the forms of gods, or claiming that these ancient polytheistic myths represent divine truth, is highly problematic.
It is often categorized as jahiliyyah, the ignorance of pre-Islamic times.
So if you are an Islamic sultan in the 16th century and your population is obsessed with shadow puppet shows depicting Hindu gods, how do these stories survive?
Why didn't the sultanates just issue a decree, ban the puppets, and burn the manuscripts?
Because the Wei Yang in these epics had become too deeply embedded in the cultural DNA of the people,
They were no longer viewed strictly as foreign religious texts. They were the absolute foundation of Javanese and Malay art, drama, and national identity.
erasing them would mean erasing a massive part of their own culture.
So the Islamic courts found a brilliant, pragmatic, bureaucratic workaround.
A legal loophole for art. How did they do it?
They added disclaimers.
Disclaimers.
Yeah. When Islamic scribes in Malaysia and Indonesia painstakingly copied these ancient manuscripts, or when puppeteers began a royal performance, they would explicitly state right at the beginning that these stories were technically untrue.
They legally framed the narratives purely as historical fables, artistic entertainments, or moral allegories, rather than divine reality.
It's the ancient equivalent of putting any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental at the start of a movie.
Hey, just for the record, under Islamic law, none of this is real. But anyway, back to the magical monkey fighting the demon.
By paying lip service to the theological requirements of the new religion, they allowed this incredibly rich, pre-Islamic cultural art form to not just survive, but to continue thriving and evolving for centuries.
It highlights the incredible resilience of these shared narratives.
They cross oceans on thermal winds, they adapt to entirely new geographies, they negotiate with new religions, and they survive.
But human stories and merchant ships weren't the only things crossing these borders.
No, they weren't.
The natural world, the very megafauna of these regions, shares a deeply interconnected and sometimes startling history that perfectly mirrors the human trade networks we've been unpacking.
When we shift our focus to the biological tapestry, specifically looking at the genomic sequencing of the region's megafauna, we find that DNA acts as an undeniable historical document.
And the most compelling example of this is the Asian elephant.
Okay, let's break down the Asian elephant, Elephas maximus.
According to our genomic sources, modern science generally recognizes three main subspecies today.
You have the elephants in Sri Lanka and southern India, you have the elephants isolated on the island of Sumatra, and you have the widespread population on the mainland of Asia.
But then there is a massive anomaly, the Borneo elephant.
The Borneo elephant has been the center of a massive, heated scientific and historical debate for decades.
For a long time, researchers weren't even sure if they naturally belonged on the island.
Physically, they are slightly different. They are sometimes colloquially referred to as pygmy elephants, though that term is heavily debated.
And genetically, they are distinctly separate from all other living Asian elephant populations.
The core of the debate is this: are they a native, ancient population that naturally evolved on the island of Borneo, or did human beings put them there?
Let's look at the first hypothesis, the native theory.
During the Pleistocene epoch, which is a geological period covering the last series of ice ages, ending about 11,000 years ago, global sea levels were drastically lower.
Because so much water was locked up in glacial ice.
And because the sea levels were lower, the geography of Southeast Asia looked completely different.
Drastically different. The islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were not islands at all.
They were all connected to the Asian mainland by a massive exposed continental shelf called Sundaland.
Under the native theory, ancestral elephants simply walked across this massive land bridge into Borneo.
When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, flooding Sundaland, the elephants were trapped and became isolated.
Genomic data does show that Bornean elephants diverged from their closest relatives, the Sumatran elephants, roughly 170,000 years ago, which aligns beautifully with this geological isolation.
Okay, so if the genetics show a split 170,000 years ago, that seems like case closed. They walked there, the water rose, they stayed. Why is there a debate?
Because science rarely offers a perfectly closed case. There is a deeply compelling competing hypothesis, the introduction theory.
This theory suggests that the original native population of elephants on Borneo actually went extinct, and the current population was introduced by humans relatively recently.
Specifically sometime between the 16th and 18th centuries.
But who has the resources, the ships, and the sheer audacity to move a breeding population of multi-ton elephants across the ocean in the 1600s?
The Sultan of Sulu.
Historical records from the region suggest that the current Borneo population might be the descendants of a localized, domesticated royal herd that originally belonged to the Sultanate of Sulu.
Which was located in the modern-day Philippines.
The theory posits that the Sultan shipped a small number of these elephants over to eastern Sabah on the island of Borneo as a royal gift, or perhaps released them there as a status symbol.
But wait, if they were introduced from a domestic herd in the Philippines so recently, where did that Philippine domestic herd come from? Elephants aren't native to the Philippines either.
That is the million-dollar biological mystery. The DNA conclusively tells us they aren't from the mainland.
So what's the leading theory?
It's that this Royal Sulu herd might have originally been captured from the now extinct Javan elephant population.
Java had its own unique population of elephants that eventually died out.
But before they went extinct, some might have been captured, domesticated, traded along those maritime networks to the Sultan of Sulu, and then eventually moved again to Borneo.
That is wild. You are looking at the last desperate survivors of a doomed island population, unknowingly saved from total extinction only because they were traded as royal pets to a completely different island.
It sounds like a myth.
Does the actual genetic data support this introduction theory?
What's fascinating here is that the newest high-resolution whole genome sequencing provides a massive, almost irrefutable clue.
What do they find?
When geneticists mapped the complete DNA profile of the modern Borneo elephant, they found the undeniable signature of a severe population bottleneck.
Let's explain what a bottleneck is in genetic terms.
It means the total population of the species shrank down to almost nothing, maybe just a handful of individuals.
This forces massive inbreeding, which drastically reduces genetic diversity before the population eventually bounces back.
You can see that lack of diversity written in the DNA code today.
The data backs that up entirely. And geneticists can calculate roughly when that bottleneck occurred by measuring the rate of genetic drift.
The DNA shows this massive restriction happened just 8 to 38 generations ago.
8 to 38 generations. For a human, a generation is about 20 to 25 years. What is it for an elephant?
It's remarkably similar. An elephant generates roughly 25 years.
So 8 to 38 generations places this severe genetic bottleneck exactly in the window of the 16th to 18th centuries.
Wow. It heavily supports the introduction hypothesis.
The genetic bottleneck is the exact biological signature you would expect if a tiny handful of domesticated elephants were dropped onto an island and forced to repopulate it from scratch.
The DNA is perfectly mirroring human historical actions.
We are literally reading the maritime trade records of a 17th century sultan coded into the genetic strands of an endangered species.
That gives me absolute chills. Human trade networks literally reshaping the evolutionary tree of the planet's largest land mammals.
And the Borneo elephant isn't the only example. Our sources mention a massive genetic anomaly with the elephants in Sri Lanka, too.
Yes, the Sri Lankan elephant. If we look at the geology, the island of Sri Lanka split from the Indian mainland about 48,000 years ago.
So, applying basic logic, you would expect the elephants living in Sri Lanka to be genetically closest to the elephants living in southern India, right across the narrow Palk Strait.
Yeah, that makes perfect geographic sense. It's a very short distance.
But the genomic data reveals the exact opposite. Sri Lankan elephants do not cluster with South Indian elephants.
They cluster most closely with elephants from Myanmar, which is thousands of miles away across the vast expanse of the Bay of Bengal.
How does an elephant population match a country thousands of miles away, rather than the country right next door?
It comes right back to the exact maritime trade networks we've been discussing since the beginning.
Sri Lanka was a massive international hub for the export and import of domesticated elephants.
Remember when we talked about the Devaraja cult and the kings seeking divine legitimacy?
Elephants were the ultimate symbol of that royal power. They were the tanks, the bulldozers, and the Rolls-Royces of the ancient world.
They were highly prized commodities.
So the kings of Sri Lanka weren't just breeding local elephants, they were importing them.
The historical records show Sri Lankan monarchs actively importing massive numbers of elephants from Myanmar to bolster the prestige and size of their own royal herds.
And those imported Myanmar elephants inevitably interbred with the local Sri Lankan population,
permanently and forever altering the island's genetic makeup.
It's just staggering to think about the logistics. We're talking about loading a frightened multi-ton animal onto a wooden sewn plank ship, hoping it doesn't shift its weight and capsize the vessel, and sailing it across the Bay of Bengal on a thermal wind.
And this biological exchange goes back much further than human trade, doesn't it?
It does. If we look beyond elephants to tigers, for instance, the genetic evidence shows that the tiger populations in India and Southeast Asia only diverged from each other about 10,000 years ago.
indicating a very recent fluid biological corridor.
But if you want to go deep into deep time,
I do. My absolute favorite biological fact from this deep dive goes back 55 million years. This entirely blew my mind.
let's talk about the scientific order Perissodactyla.
This is the order of odd-toed ungulates, which includes modern rhinos, horses, and tapirs.
According to the fossil evidence in our sources, this entire order of mammals actually originated on the Indian plate.
Which, crucially, 55 million years ago, was not attached to the continent of Asia.
Right. India was essentially a massive island. It had violently broken off from the supercontinent of Gondwana, separating from Madagascar and Antarctica, and was drifting rapidly northward across the ancient Tethys Ocean.
I just have this incredible cinematic image of the Indian subcontinent functioning as this massive floating biological arc.
Hurtling across the ocean, carrying the ancestors of all the world's horses and rhinos.
And then, boom, it violently crashes into the underbelly of Asia, a collision so massive it raises the Himalayan mountains.
It essentially drops the ramp of the ark and unloads its bizarre biological cargo onto the Asian continent.
It is a wonderful, highly functional analogy. The tectonic collision of India and Asia wasn't just a geological event. It was a massive biological convergence that seeded the continent with entirely new lineages of life.
Just as, millions of years later, the monsoon trade winds would create a cultural, commercial, and artistic convergence.
So what does this all mean for us today?
If you are listening to this right now, and you are as captivated by this interconnected history as we are, you might be thinking, I want to go see this.
I want to physically walk in the footsteps of these ancient Austronesian merchants, these Brahmin priests, and these royal elephants.
And if you ask the average person to name a historical site in Southeast Asia, almost everyone will immediately say Angkor Wat in Cambodia.
Which is magnificent, undoubtedly. It is a pinnacle of human achievement.
But because it is so famous, it is also incredibly crowded, often packed shoulder to shoulder with tourists.
Exactly. We wanted to give you something different. We combed through the archaeological sources to build you a historically minded traveler's guide.
We are going to trace a hypothetical journey through incredibly significant, deeply historic sites that are completely off the beaten path.
These are places surrounded by beautiful forests and mountains where you can actually hear the wind.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a second-century merchant. Where are we starting?
Let's start the journey in Malaysia, specifically in the Bujang Valley, located in the state of Kedah.
Visually, this is stunning. It is set against the incredibly lush, imposing green backdrop of Mount Chirai.
For sailors riding the northeast monsoon from India across the Bay of Bengal, Mount Chirai was a massive navigational beacon.
The Bujang Valley was often their very first landfall.
And it boasts a pretty incredible archaeological record.
It does. The specific site of Sungai Batu within the valley contains the oldest known man-made structure in Southeast Asia, dating back to roughly 110 AD.
But what's truly fascinating is what they were actually doing there. This wasn't just a quiet religious sanctuary.
Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of massive ancient jetties and, most importantly, a highly sophisticated industrial-scale iron smelting hub.
Let's explain that, because iron smelting in the 2nd century is incredibly labor-intensive.
You have to build bloomery furnaces, heat them to extreme temperatures using massive amounts of charcoal,
And chemically strip the oxygen away from the iron oxide ore just to get a usable piece of metal.
and they were doing this on an industrial scale.
They were pulling iron out of the earth, smelting it in the shadow of the mountain, and exporting it across the ocean.
Bujang Valley represents the gritty, heavy industry economic reality that underpinned this entire maritime network.
Okay, our ship is repaired with fresh Kedah iron. We wait for the wind, and we sail south to Sumatra, in modern-day Indonesia. We are heading to the Muaro Jambi Temple compound.
I cannot overstate the scale of Muarajambi. It spans 3,981 hectares along the banks of the Batanghari River.
To put that in perspective for the listener, that is roughly 24 times the size of the entire Angkor Wat temple complex.
It is a vast, sprawling network of ancient red brick temples and massive earthen mounds called menapos, scattered deeply throughout the lush Sumatran jungle.
And it wasn't just a place to pray.
Far from it. From the 7th to the 14th centuries, during the height of the Srivijaya and Malayu kingdoms, Muaro Jambi functioned as a massive, international Buddhist university and scientific center.
It was effectively the Oxford or Harvard of the ancient Indo-Pacific. Monks, scholars, and scientists from India, China, and Tibet traveled across the oceans specifically to study there.
They debated advanced Buddhist philosophy, studied early medicine, and mastered Sanskrit grammar.
It was a bustling, highly cosmopolitan intellectual metropolis hidden beneath the rainforest canopy.
Walking through those overgrown red brick ruins today, listening to the jungle birds without the noise of tour buses, you are literally standing exactly where the brightest minds of Asia debated the nature of the universe 1,000 years ago.
Okay, our scholar merchant has finished his studies. He loads his ship and sails north to Vietnam. We are dropping anchor at Akio.
Akio is located in the Anjing province, deep in the muddy, fertile flatlands of the Mekong Delta.
If Bajang Valley was the industrial hub and Muarujambi was the university, Akio was the ultimate international bazaar.
It was the primary port city of the ancient Funan Kingdom, featuring an incredibly complex network of canals that allowed ships to sail directly into the city.
And the artifacts archaeologists have pulled out of the mud here are unbelievable. They found 5th century statues of the Hindu god Vishnu, which, given everything we've talked about with the Devaraja cult and Indianization, makes perfect sense.
But they also found Roman coins.
Yes, specifically gold medallions featuring the profile of the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius dating back to the 2nd century AD.
I need the listener to think about the mechanical chain of custody required for that to happen. A coin is minted in the heart of Rome.
It is carried across the Mediterranean to Egypt.
It is traded to Arabian sailors who carry it down the Red Sea.
It is handed off to Indian spice merchants on the Malabar coast, who then carry it across the Bay of Bengal on the monsoon winds.
All the way to a muddy canal city in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam.
Akio proves definitively that this network was connecting Rome, India, and China centuries and centuries before Marco Polo was even born.
It is the physical proof of ancient globalization. Now let's leave the coast and look inland at Myanmar. We are visiting the ancient PU city of Sri Setra.
Myanmar is a visually stunning country with a very complex history, but architecturally, Sri Kshetra is a complete marvel.
It is a massive circular city, heavily walled and surrounded by complex moats.
What you'll see there are some of the earliest and most monumental brick stupas in all of Southeast Asia.
A stupa is a massive, solid, bell-shaped or hemispherical structure containing Buddhist relics.
Sri Kshetra preserves the absolute earliest wave of Theravada Buddhist expansion into the region.
Let's define Theravada quickly. It's often considered the oldest surviving branch of Buddhism, focusing heavily on monastic discipline and the original teachings of the Buddha, as opposed to the later Mahayana traditions.
The data backs that up. And at Sri Kshetra, you find the oldest Pali inscriptions, the sacred language of Theravada Buddhism ever discovered in the region.
Architecturally, the massive stupas here are the grandparents. They are the direct precursors to the thousands of famous temples you see later at Bagan.
And for our final stop, we have a hidden gem nestled in central Thailand's Sithep.
Sithep was a major thriving city of the Dvaravati culture, hidden away in the lush Pasok River Valley.
What makes Sithep so compelling for a historically minded traveler is its artwork. It physically showcases the stunning, beautiful interplay between the different religious traditions we've discussed.
Our sources highlight a very specific, famous sculpture found hidden in the ruins there, the Tribhanga Vishnu.
Tribhanga translates to a specific three-bended pose in traditional classical Indian art, where the body is gracefully curved at the neck, the waist, and the knee.
To find this exquisite textbook classical Hindu sculpture nestled deeply within a predominantly Buddhist archaeological layer, just perfectly, physically captures the cultural buffet we talked about earlier.
They didn't silo these religions, they placed them side by side.
So what does this all mean? When you visit the iron smelters of the Bujang Valley, or the red brick universities of Muarujambi, or the intricate statues of Sithep, you aren't just looking at old stones.
You are looking at the literal connective tissue of the ancient world.
You get the rare chance to physically stand at the crossroads of early globalization. You can breathe in the jungle air while touching the bricks that built the Indo-Pacific convergence.
We've covered an immense continent-spanning amount of ground today.
We've traced the incredible bravery of the Austronesian sailors, who dared to ride the thermal engine of the monsoon winds in flexible, sewn plank ships, inadvertently wiring the ancient world together.
We've examined how Southeast Asian kings didn't just passively accept foreign colonization, but actively and strategically invited Brahmins in,
selectively blending the imported concept of the god king with their own ancient indigenous mountain spirits.
We've watched the solemn, celibate Hanuman of India transform into the swashbuckling, mermaid-seducing lover of the Thai ramekin.
And we've read the history of human maritime trade, written in the very DNA of the Asian elephant, tracking a sultan's royal gift across the centuries through undeniable genetic bottlenecks.
This entire deep dive fundamentally challenges so much of what we assume about how the world actually gets connected.
We have a modern bias. We tend to think that globalization strictly requires dominance.
We think it requires a massive industrialized empire with a vastly superior military, forcing everyone to speak their language, use their currency, and follow their laws.
But that is emphatically not what happened here, and that leads to a final, larger implication I'd like to leave you with.
We've seen how deeply integrated, wildly creative, and incredibly resilient these pre-colonial networks were, achieved entirely without a central colonizing hegemony.
It was an ancient network built on shared myths, voluntary trade, technological adaptation, and mutual respect
Yeah.
that thrived for literally thousands of years.
It forces us to question our own modern architecture. If a sprawling, highly complex global system could operate so organically and beautifully back then, what invisible organic networks are we unconsciously building right now?
What shared digital myths and unseen cultural exchanges are wiring our modern world together in ways that will only become visible to archaeologists digging through our servers 2,000 years from now.
It makes you wonder what our genetic bottlenecks and our broken artifacts will say about us.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We hope it changed the way you see the map, the wind, and maybe even the jar of nutmeg in your pantry.
Keep exploring, keep questioning the narrative, and honestly, maybe start booking a flight to the Bujang Valley.
The world is vastly older, more flexible, and more intimately connected than we usually give it credit for. We'll see you next time.